Don't touch my granddaughter." The words cracked through the hotel lobby just as the lights flickered once, twice, then dropped the whole room into a dim amber haze. For half a second, nobody moved. The chandeliers above the marble floor went dark, the soft piano music cut off mid-note, and the only thing left was the hard rattle of rain against the glass walls facing the ocean. Naomi Brooks stood beside her housekeeping cart near the east corridor, one hand still wrapped around a stack of folded towels, her name tag catching the weak glow of the emergency lights. Across the lobby, a little girl in a pale yellow cardigan sat frozen on a velvet bench, both hands pressed over her ears, her small shoulders rising too fast, too sharp, like each breath had to fight its way in. Her grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, clutched a leather handbag to her side and looked around with the brittle panic of someone who was used to calling for help and getting it before the second word left her mouth. But tonight, no one moved fast enough. The storm had swallowed the coast an hour earlier, and the Grand Atlantic Hotel, with all its polished brass, white orchids, and quiet wealth, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a glass box caught in the fist of the sea. Naomi had noticed them long before the lights went out. She had noticed the grandmother pulling the child a little closer when Naomi stepped into the elevator with fresh linens. She had noticed the quick glance at her dark hands, the polite little silence that carried more judgment than any insult spoken out loud. She had noticed the way a man in a navy raincoat asked the front desk for another blanket, but said, without lowering his voice, "Not from housekeeping. I want a clean one." Naomi had kept her face still, the way she always did, and gone back to work. She was good at disappearing when people needed someone to blame their discomfort on. Good at making beds with hospital corners so sharp they looked untouched. Good at pushing her cart over thick carpet without a sound. Good at swallowing things. But now the girl on the bench was not just scared. Naomi could see it from 20 feet away. The child was trying to breathe and not finding enough air. There was a difference between fear and the body beginning to fail, and Naomi knew that difference the way some people knew hymns by heart. A loud boom rolled over the building as something outside hit the service gate, and several guests gasped. Somewhere deeper in the hotel, a generator coughed, stuttered, then caught. Soft yellow floor lights blinked on along the baseboards. Sophie Whitmore, because Naomi had heard the name twice already, gave a thin, broken sound and curled tighter into herself. Naomi set the towels down on her cart. Eleanor saw her moving and stepped in front of the child instantly, chin high, eyes cold even in fear. "I said don't touch her." Naomi stopped, not startled, not offended, just still. Rainwater streamed in crooked lines down the tall windows behind them, and the whole lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish, wet wool, and the electric heat of too many frightened people in one room. Naomi looked past Eleanor and met the little girl's eyes. They were wide, glassy, begging without words. Then another flash of lightning turned the lobby white for a heartbeat, and Naomi knew this night was about to trap all of them inside together. Naomi did not move right away. She had learned a long time ago that in rooms like this, one wrong step from the wrong person could turn concern into accusation before the truth had time to breathe. So she kept her hands at her sides and let the silence stretch for one more second while the storm pressed its full weight against the ocean-facing windows. Somewhere above them, wind moaned through the upper terraces. In the far hallway, a service door slammed once, then rattled in its frame. Sophie Whitmore made a strained little sound, not quite a cry, and bent forward harder, her fingers digging into the yellow knit at her sleeves. Naomi watched the girl's chest. Too fast, too shallow. Her pulse kicked once behind her ribs. This was not just fear anymore. Eleanor turned toward the front desk with that stiff, urgent energy rich people wore when they were not used to waiting. "Where is your manager?" she snapped. "Where is security? Somebody do something." A young concierge in a burgundy jacket looked barely old enough to rent a car. He stood frozen behind the marble counter, headset dead at his ear, eyes darting from the dark computer. Screens to the child on the bench. "We are trying to get the backup systems online, ma'am," he said, though his voice carried no confidence at all. Another guest muttered that the roads had already flooded. Someone else asked whether the storm shutters had sealed. The air in the lobby thickened with perfume, damp coats, and the metallic tang of rain sneaking in each time the outer doors shuddered under the wind. Naomi knew that smell. It was the smell of a building trying to hold itself together. She also knew something else. People had been watching her all afternoon, and not kindly. A few hours earlier, before the sky turned slate gray and the first thunder rolled in off the water, she had ridden the west elevator to the 12th floor with 2 guests from Chicago and a woman in pearls who smelled like gardenias and cold cream. The elevator had been crowded, but when Naomi stepped in with fresh towels stacked in her arms, the woman in pearls had shifted her purse to the other side and drawn her grandson close with a tiny practiced motion, as if caution itself were elegance. The men from Chicago had gone quiet. Then one of them, staring at Naomi's cart reflected in the mirrored wall, said to no one in particular, "Funny how luxury means everybody smiles until staff gets too close." The other man had laughed through his nose. Naomi had stared at the glowing numbers above the door and said nothing. On the 9th floor, the woman in pearls stepped off and requested another elevator instead of sharing one more stop with her. Later, in room 814, a couple celebrating an anniversary had asked for fresh pillowcases and then stood in the doorway watching Naomi change them, eyes following every movement of her hands as if she might pocket the silver pin on the nightstand or the watch left beside the lamp. When she finished, the husband checked the dresser drawers after she walked out. Naomi had seen it in the mirror before the door closed. She had kept walking. That was how this place worked when the chandeliers were lit and the sea looked pretty from the bar. People loved service. They just did not love the people who served them. Another crack of thunder pulled Naomi back to the lobby. Sophie's lips had gone paler now. The girl looked up at her through strands of hair stuck to her damp forehead. And whatever Eleanor Whitmore believed about who was safe and who was not, that child knew the simple truth of bodies. She knew who had noticed. Naomi took one careful step forward and spoke softly, not to the grandmother, but to the girl. "Sophie, I am going to help you breathe. You do not have to be afraid of my hands." For a moment, Eleanor looked as if she might stop her again. The woman's shoulders were drawn tight beneath her cream cashmere coat, one hand still gripping the strap of her handbag, so hard her knuckles had gone pale under the yellow emergency light. But Sophie gave a shallow, trembling gasp and leaned toward Naomi instead of away from her, and that small movement changed the balance in the room. Naomi crossed the last few feet with quiet, careful steps and lowered herself to one knee in front of the bench, making herself smaller, softer, easier for the child to trust. Up close, she could hear the faint whistle in Sophie's breathing. Not loud, not dramatic, just thin and wrong. The kind of sound most people missed because fear was easier to see than air. Naomi set 2 fingers against the edge of the velvet cushion, not touching the girl yet, and kept her voice low. "Look at me, baby. Not the windows. Not the storm. Just me." Sophie's eyes were wet and wide. She tried, failed, and tried again. Naomi could see the panic chasing itself behind them. Another blast of thunder rolled over the hotel, long and heavy, shaking a crystal vase on the front desk. Several guests flinched. One woman near the bar covered her ears. A man in loafers and a soaked sport coat muttered that the place should have evacuated sooner. Naomi tuned them all out. "That is right," she said gently. "I want you to listen to my voice. We are going to slow everything down." Sophie's small hands were curled so tightly that the cuffs of her cardigan had twisted halfway around her wrists. Naomi recognized that too. Years ago, during summer storms in Savannah, her little brother Caleb used to do the same thing when thunder rattled the windows of their duplex. He would press himself into the corner of the couch, breathing too fast, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if fear lived up there in the cracks. Naomi had been 12 the first time their mother put a paper lunch bag in her hands and said, "Stay calm for him, even if you are not calm for yourself." Later, when the doctors finally called it asthma and not nerves, Naomi learned inhalers, timing, the warning look that came before a child could no longer catch enough breath to cry. She had not thought about Caleb in weeks. Now his memory came back with the smell of wet carpet and lemon cleaner and the ocean beating against glass. "Sophie," Naomi said, "can you show me where your medicine is?" The girl swallowed hard and pointed toward the elevators with a shaky finger. "Room," she whispered. Eleanor found her voice at once. "Penthouse level. Her inhaler is upstairs." Naomi looked toward the bank of elevators. Dark. Dead. A red service light blinked weakly, then went out. The concierge behind the desk spoke up in a tight voice. All elevators are offline until the backup system stabilizes. Then send someone up the stairs, Eleanor snapped. Now. No one moved. The stair access to the upper levels required staff keys after 10 o'clock, and in the confusion, the front desk clerks only looked at one another, each waiting for somebody with more authority to appear. Daniel Reed, the night manager, finally hurried out from the back office, tie loosened, radio useless at his belt. His face had the strained look of a man trying to seem in control in front of guests who could ruin his week with one online review. He took in the bench, the child, Naomi kneeling on the marble floor in her housekeeping uniform, and his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Naomi, he said, low and warning. Step back and let us handle this. Naomi lifted her eyes to his, then glanced at Sophie, whose breathing had turned faster again the second the voices around her rose. She made her choice in that same quiet heartbeat. Sir, she said, calm as folded linen. If we wait for this room to decide who is in charge, that little girl is going to get worse. Daniel Reed opened his mouth, probably to say something about policy, liability, guest protocol, all the clean words managers used when fear needed a suit and tie. But before he could speak, a sharp mechanical groan rolled through the hotel, deep and metallic, like the building itself had shifted its weight. Every head in the lobby turned toward the glass entrance just as the storm shutters began dropping over the front windows with a heavy, shuddering force. One panel jammed halfway, then slammed into place on the second try, sealing out the black sweep of the ocean and most of the light with it. The lobby dimmed another shade. A woman near the concierge desk let out a small cry. Somewhere upstairs, an alarm began beeping in slow intervals. Daniel pressed a hand to his radio, then seemed to remember it was still dead. All right, he said, louder now, trying to gather authority out of the air. Everyone needs to stay calm. The hotel is in storm lockdown until engineering clears the lower levels and the backup grid stabilizes. Lockdown, one guest repeated. You mean we cannot leave? The county emergency order closed the bridge an hour ago, Daniel said, and the basement has taken on water. For now, yes, everybody stays inside. The words landed hard. Naomi felt the change in the room immediately. It was not just fear anymore. It was the heavier thing that came after people realized money could not open a door against weather. Wet coats rustled. Designer luggage sat abandoned beside velvet chairs. Someone demanded satellite phone access. Someone else asked for private transportation, as if a black SUV could drive through the Atlantic. Sophie gave another fragile breath and bent forward harder. Naomi leaned in, lowering her voice until the world narrowed to the child and the small trembling space around her. Sophie, I need you to listen to me. I know it feels like the air is running away, but we're going to bring it back. The little girl blinked at her, lashes wet, and gave the smallest nod. Eleanor looked between Naomi and Daniel, pride and panic fighting openly across her face. Do something, she said again, but this time the command had cracked in the middle. Naomi stood in one smooth motion and reached beneath the lower shelf of her housekeeping cart. From behind a stack of hand towels, she pulled out a small silver key ring clipped to a retractable cord. Staff keys. Master access for service halls, laundry, linen storage, and emergency stairwells. Daniel's eyes dropped to it. At once. Naomi, he said, sharper now, those routes are restricted during lockdown. So are elevators, she replied. And her inhaler is upstairs. Another boom shook the building, softer this time, but close enough to make dust drift from one of the decorative ceiling beams. Sophie flinched so hard her shoes scraped the marble. Naomi crouched again and met her eyes. I know a quieter way, she said. No big lobby. No crowd. Just me and your grandma, if she wants to come. Eleanor hesitated. Naomi could almost see the woman's whole life pressing against that pause. Country clubs. Private schools. Handshakes with the right people. The neat old instinct that told her who belonged near her family and who did not. Then Sophie reached one shaking hand toward Naomi's sleeve. It was not a dramatic gesture. Barely more than fingertips against fabric. But it ended the argument. Eleanor swallowed, her face pale beneath careful makeup. I am coming too, she said. Daniel exhaled through his nose, defeated but not convinced. Fine. Use the east service stairs. Stay on the interior wall. And if engineering stops you, this was my call. Naomi nodded once. Around them, The lobby buzzed with trapped voices and nervous motion. But for the first time that night, she knew exactly where she needed to go. She slipped one arm gently around Sophie's shoulders, took hold of the housekeeping cart with the other, and turned toward the unmarked hallway that guests spent fortunes never noticing. The unmarked hallway behind the lobby swallowed sound almost instantly. The carpet gave way to sealed gray tile, then to the faint squeak of Naomi's rubber soles as she guided her cart past linen closets, service alcoves, and framed evacuation maps no guest had ever bothered to read. The air was cooler back there, touched with bleach, clean cotton, and the low burnt smell of overworked emergency wiring. Sophie stayed close against Naomi's side, one hand gripping the edge of her housekeeping apron, as if that plain blue fabric had become the safest thing in the building. Eleanor followed half a step behind, her heels clicking too sharply in the narrow corridor, her breathing quick for a woman who was trying very hard not to show fear. Overhead, the emergency lights buzzed in dull yellow strips, flattening every color into something tired and honest. Without the chandeliers, without the polished lobby, and the smiling staff at the front desk, the hotel felt different here. Less grand, more human. Naomi liked it better this way. "Keep your eyes on me, Sophie," she said softly as they reached the first service door. She slid her key card through the reader, heard the lock click, and pushed into the east stairwell. Concrete walls, steel rails, the cold, hollow smell of dust and rain sneaking through somewhere above. Sophie flinched at the sound of the heavy door closing behind them, but Naomi was ready for it. "That is all right," she murmured. "It is just a door doing its job." The little girl tried to smile and could not quite get there. Naomi knelt one step below her, so they were eye level. In the stairwell light, she could see the details more clearly now. The small pull at the base of Sophie's throat with each breath, the tightness around her mouth, the way panic had made her cold fingers turn almost colorless against the cardigan. Eleanor hovered nearby, clutching the rail with one hand and her handbag with the other, as though even now she could not decide which mattered more. "She has had attacks before," Eleanor said, too quickly, as if explaining herself to a stranger she did not trust. "Only in bad weather, or when she gets overexcited. We keep the inhaler in her overnight bag, always in the front pocket. I packed it myself." Naomi looked up. "Did she use it today?" Eleanor hesitated, and in that hesitation Naomi heard the truth before the woman spoke it. "I thought she would be fine after dinner." Naomi nodded once. No judgment in her face. No lecture. Just the quiet acceptance of facts the way they were. "Then we do not waste time." They started up the stairs, Naomi keeping her pace steady, not too fast, never letting the child feel rushed. Sophie climbed 3 steps, then paused, pressing a hand to the wall. Naomi watched her closely. People around a frightened child often made one mistake. They called everything anxiety because anxiety was familiar, manageable, almost polite. But Naomi could hear the change now. The breath was not only quick, it was narrowing. She set the brakes on her cart and took a folded hand towel from the top shelf. Then she crouched and placed it gently in Sophie's hands. "Smell this," she said. "Fresh laundry. Tell me what it reminds you of." Sophie blinked. "Home," she whispered after a second. "My bed." "Good," Naomi said. "That means your mind is still with us. We are going to keep it there." Eleanor stared at her. Not with disdain this time. Not even with suspicion. Something else had entered the woman's expression now. Something more fragile and much harder to carry. The first thin crack of trust. Then a muffled voice echoed from somewhere above them, followed by hurried footsteps on the landing. And Naomi knew the storm was not the only thing moving through the hotel tonight. The footsteps grew louder, quick and uneven. Then a man in a hotel engineering jacket rounded the landing above them with a flashlight in one hand and a ring of keys bouncing at his hip. Water had darkened the shoulders of his uniform, and his face was slick with sweat despite the chill in the concrete stairwell. He stopped short when he saw Naomi, then Eleanor, then the little girl pressed against the rail. "You cannot come up this way," he said, breathing hard. "Upper corridor access is restricted. We have got water intrusion on 16 and partial loss of power on the penthouse level." Eleanor straightened at once. "My granddaughter's inhaler is in our suite." The engineer looked at Sophie and then away, the way people did when they knew a problem was real but did not want to be the one holding it. "Ma'am, I understand. But if those mag locks fail while you are up there, I will have more people trapped in a blind hallway. Naomi lifted her chin. Then tell me the safest route. He blinked at her, almost offended by the question coming from a maid with a housekeeping cart and damp curls clinging at her temples. The service corridor off 14 is still clear, he said after a second. But the guest elevators are dead, and the south stairwell is blocked with linen bins from banquet storage. You would have to cut through the maintenance passage and come up the rear. Naomi nodded as if he had just confirmed what she already suspected. She knew those passages, knew which doors stuck in humid weather, which corners smelled like hot pipes, which emergency lights flickered 3 seconds before failing. She had spent enough midnight shifts in this hotel to know its hidden bones better than most of the people paid to manage it. Then that is where we go, she said. Daniel's warning from the lobby drifted through her mind for half a second, but she let it pass. There was no room left tonight for staying in the place people had assigned her. The engineer gave a doubtful laugh. You cannot take guests through maintenance. Naomi looked at Sophie, whose breath had grown thinner again, her small chest lifting in quick, shallow pulls that made the air feel scarce just to witness. Watch me, Naomi said quietly. The stairwell went still, not silent, because the storm was still thundering outside the concrete shell and the old pipes were still humming above them. But still in the way a room sometimes goes when someone unexpected says the only true thing in it. Eleanor stared at Naomi as if hearing her clearly for the first time. Not as staff, not as background, as a person who knew what to do. Naomi reached for the handle of her cart, then paused and stripped it down with fast, efficient hands. Towels on the top rack, small bottled waters in the side caddy, a flashlight from the supply compartment, a folded thermal blanket from the emergency kit housekeeping kept for stranded guests during winter outages. She tucked the blanket around Sophie's shoulders, handed Eleanor the water, and clipped the flashlight onto her apron. I need both of you close to me, she said. No sudden stops. No looking back every time the building makes a sound. It is old. It complains. That does not mean it is falling apart. Sophie gave the faintest nod and pressed the fresh towel to her nose again, breathing in laundry starch and soap as if it were proof that ordinary things still existed. The engineer stepped aside at last, uncertain but out of arguments. Naomi pushed open the next steel door, and a rush of cooler air met them from the maintenance passage beyond. It smelled of concrete dust, machine oil, and the sea trying to find a way in. She tightened her grip on the cart and led them forward, deeper into the parts of the hotel guests paid fortunes never to see. The maintenance passage ran behind the grand parts of the hotel like a second spine, all pipes, utility panels, and humming walls, none of it polished, none of it pretending. Naomi moved through it with the steady confidence of someone who had spent enough midnight hours here to know which floor drains backed up after hard rain and which service doors stuck when the sea air turned the hinges sticky. The wheels of her cart rattled softly over unfinished concrete. Above them, the storm pressed and shifted, a giant restless thing pacing the roof. Sophie stayed tucked close between Naomi and Eleanor, wrapped in the silver thermal blanket now, her breath still thin but a little less frantic as she followed the beam of Naomi's flashlight cutting a pale tunnel through the dim. You are doing good, Naomi said without turning around. Just keep matching your steps to mine. Behind her, Eleanor said nothing. The woman who had once filled every silence with instructions now seemed to be listening instead, to the pipes, to the rain, to the measured calm in Naomi's voice. They reached a narrow junction where the maintenance passage met a service corridor lined with housekeeping supply shelves, banquet chairs stacked in rolling racks, and crates of bottled water waiting for conferences that would not happen tonight. Naomi knew if they took the left turn, they could reach the rear stairwell that opened onto the penthouse level. She had just started that way when voices spilled toward them from the opposite corridor, sharp and fast, and carrying the brittle edge of panic. Daniel Reed appeared first, tie gone now, white shirt damp at the collar, followed by the woman in pearls from the elevator earlier, a heavy-set man in a golf pullover, and 2 security staff with battery lanterns. Daniel stopped dead when his light hit Naomi. Relief flashed across his face for less than a second, then vanished under the weight of the guests behind him. There she is, the woman in pearls said, pointing before anyone could speak. That is the maid I told you about. Naomi felt Eleanor stiffen beside her. Daniel looked from Naomi to Sophie and back again, already bracing for trouble. The man in the golf pullover stepped forward, his loafers splashing through a thin ribbon of water creeping under the wall. "My wife's diamond bracelet is missing," he said. "She took us through the back hall earlier on 12, and now it is gone." Naomi blinked once. Not with surprise, more with the deep tiredness of hearing the oldest script in the world dressed up as an emergency. "I did not take anything from your room," she said. "I have not been on 12 since 6 o'clock. "Convenient," the woman in pearls snapped. "People are trapped, the cameras are down, and suddenly valuables disappear." One of the security guards shifted uneasily, lantern light trembling across steel shelves and mop buckets. Daniel rubbed a hand over his mouth. "Ma'am, sir, this is not the time." "It is exactly the time," the man shot back. "You want us to believe staff roaming restricted corridors has nothing to do with missing jewelry." Sophie made a frightened sound and clutched Naomi's apron again. Eleanor opened her mouth, but Naomi spoke first, her voice low and level enough to still the corridor for a beat. "A little girl cannot breathe right, and you are worried about a bracelet." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Even Daniel looked away. The woman in pearls flushed. "Do not take that tone with me." Naomi did not. She only reached slowly into the side pocket of her cart, pulled out a clear plastic laundry bag, and held it open with one hand. Inside were only fresh towels, toiletries, and the flashlight batteries she had been issued at the start of her shift. "Check it," she said. "Check every shelf, every pocket, every folded towel. But after that, either help this child get her medicine or step out of my way." No one reached for the bag at first. The lantern light shook across the clear plastic and the folded towels inside, catching on bottle caps, travel soaps, and the cheap silver edge of a housekeeping flashlight. The corridor seemed to hold its breath with Sophie. Water ticked somewhere behind the wall. A pipe gave a low hollow knock. Then Daniel stepped forward, face drawn tight with exhaustion, and took the bag from Naomi's hand. He looked inside, then deeper, pushing aside washcloths, checking the side pocket, the lower shelf, the emergency blanket wrapper, even the small zipper pouch where staff kept lost room key cards until security logged them. Nothing. No bracelet. No glittering proof for the fear these guests had already decided to believe. The man in the golf pullover stared as if the facts had personally inconvenienced him. The woman in pearls folded her arms, her mouth thinning into a line that did not quite know how to recover dignity from being wrong. Naomi did not look at either of them. She was watching Sophie. The child had gone quieter, which was not always a good sign. Her breaths were still too shallow, and now there was a fragile, strained look around her eyes that made Naomi's stomach tighten. "Daniel," Naomi said, her voice steady but lower now, more urgent because she no longer had time for the room's nonsense. "She needs to sit down somewhere still. No crowd. No arguing." Daniel handed the bag back without a word. His ears had gone red. Before he could speak, Eleanor Whitmore moved. It was small, almost awkward, like a person learning a language she should have known years ago. She stepped between Naomi and the accusing guests, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to change the geometry of the hallway. "You heard her," Eleanor said, and there was no tremor in her voice this time. "My granddaughter needs help. If any of you have misplaced jewelry, I suggest you search your own pockets before you search her character." The corridor went very still after that. Naomi looked at Eleanor for one brief second. No smile. No forgiveness offered too early. Just recognition. Then she guided Sophie to a folded stack of banquet linens set against the service wall and sat down beside her on the concrete floor. The silver thermal blanket whispered as the little girl curled into it. Naomi took the fresh towel gently from Sophie's hands and replaced it with her own open palm, held a few inches away. "Follow my hand," she murmured. "Not because it is magic, just because it gives your body one thing to do at a time." Sophie's eyes found her fingers. Naomi raised her hand slowly on the inhale, lowered it on the exhale, making each motion smooth and deliberate, like drawing calm out of the air itself. "That is it," she said. "In through your nose if you can. Out slow. You are not racing the storm. Let it wear itself out." The words settled into the dim corridor like warm cloth. Daniel dismissed the other guests with a look that finally carried some backbone, and one by one they drifted back toward the junction, their lantern light fading, their certainty fading with it. Soon only the hum of old wiring remained. the smell of detergent and wet concrete, and the thin rise and fall of Sophie's breathing. Eleanor sank to the floor on the other side of her granddaughter, her coat pooling neatly around her knees, her expensive shoes damp with stairwell water and not seeming to matter anymore. She watched Naomi's hand, then the child, then Naomi again. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet enough that it almost disappeared beneath the storm. "I was wrong about you." Naomi kept her eyes on Sophie and answered with the gentleness of someone who had no spare energy left for pride. "Right now, ma'am, let us just be right for her." For the first time since the lights had gone out, Sophie's breathing found a rhythm that did not sound like it was breaking apart. Not normal yet, not safe enough for Naomi to relax, but steadier. In through the nose when she could manage it, out through parted lips when fear made everything tighten again. Naomi kept her palm moving in slow, even arcs, letting the child borrow calm the way people borrowed blankets when the temperature dropped too fast. The maintenance corridor around them had gone almost reverent. The accusing voices were gone now. Even the storm seemed farther away, as if the walls, the pipes, the storage racks full of folded banquet linens had decided to protect this one small pocket of breathing space. Eleanor sat with one hand pressed to her own chest, watching Naomi not with confusion anymore, but with the unsettled attention people reserved for moments that changed something they had believed about the world. Daniel remained near the junction, speaking in a low voice to security, but he kept glancing back as though he knew the center of the night was no longer the lobby, no longer the flooded basement, no longer the angry guests demanding updates. It was here, on a concrete floor no one paid to see, where a maid in a damp uniform was holding the whole room together with nothing but patience and a voice that never rose. Naomi leaned closer to Sophie. "Can you tell me something true?" she asked softly. Sophie blinked at her. "What? Tell me what color your room is." The child swallowed and looked down at the thermal blanket gathered in her lap. "Blue," she whispered. "Pale blue. Good. And your inhaler bag? What does it look like?" "White," Sophie said after a beat. "With tiny gold stars." Naomi nodded. "That is very good. Your mind is staying with us." Eleanor's eyes filled at that, though she blinked the tears away before they could fall. She had probably spent a lifetime learning how not to unravel in front of strangers. Tonight that discipline looked less like strength and more like loneliness. Naomi knew the difference. She had seen it in hotel mirrors late at night, when women fixed their lipstick before returning to dinners they did not enjoy. She had seen it in rich men staring too long at ocean views they had paid extra for, and still could not sit still inside. Money made people quieter about their pain. It did not make them wiser with it. Sophie's fingers loosened against the blanket. She stared at Naomi's face for a long second, studying her the way children did when they were deciding whether to hand over trust completely. Then she reached out and caught the cuff of Naomi's sleeve again. "I want her," Sophie said, barely above a breath. The words were simple, but they changed the air in the corridor more than thunder had. Eleanor closed her eyes for half a second, and when she opened them, something proud and brittle in her expression was gone. Not shattered, just set down. She looked at Naomi with the naked humility of a woman who had spent hours fearing the wrong thing. "Then she stays with you," Eleanor said. Naomi gave a small nod, no triumph in it, no need to prove what the child had already decided. Daniel stepped forward at last. "Engineering cleared the rear service lift to the penthouse corridor for one trip," he said quietly. "It is manual access only, but it should get us close enough to the suite." Naomi rose in one fluid motion, then held out her hand to Sophie. The child looked at it for only a second before placing her smaller one inside. Warm now. Still trembling, but warm. Naomi felt the weight of that trust settle into her palm, light as paper and heavier than anything else in the hotel. Then she helped Sophie to her feet, turned toward the service lift, and led them deeper into the dark. The service lift was tucked behind a pair of gray metal doors at the end of the maintenance corridor, the kind of place guests would mistake for a storage closet and never think about again. Tonight it looked like a lifeline. Daniel swiped a manual override key, and the doors shuddered open with a tired mechanical groan. Inside, the small freight car smelled of steel, dust, and old detergent trapped in the seams. The emergency bulb overhead cast a weak orange circle that made every face look drawn and quieter than before. Naomi guided Sophie inside first, keeping one hand wrapped around the little girl's fingers and the other steady on the cart handle. Eleanor stepped in after them, her silk scarf damp at the edges now, her careful polish beginning to give way to the truth of the night. Daniel remained at the threshold, one hand braced against the frame while he listened to the faint crackle of a borrowed radio a security guard had finally managed to revive. The message came through in broken pieces. Water. Lower electrical room. Backup strain. Engineering rerouting power. Naomi felt something in her chest turn cold. Not fear exactly. Recognition. She had worked enough storm shifts in old buildings to know that when men started speaking in clipped half-sentences about power, the real problem was usually already larger than the words. The lift lurched once as Daniel hit the control for the upper service level. Sophie flinched, and Naomi tightened her grip just enough to remind the child she was not alone. Look at me, she said softly. Not the walls. Not the sound. Just me. Sophie did. Her breathing was still thinner than Naomi liked, but it no longer had that frantic edge that made every inhale sound borrowed. The doors slid shut, and the little freight car began to climb with a rough, grinding hum. Somewhere above them, wind dragged its knuckles across the building. For 3 floors, everything held. Then the lift jerked so hard Eleanor caught the side rail with both hands. The orange bulb overhead flickered once, twice, then dimmed to a weak ember. Sophie's eyes widened. Daniel cursed under his breath and pressed the emergency stop panel with the flat of his hand, as though human certainty might steady machinery. The lift stalled between floors. Silence followed, thick and unnatural, broken only by the ticking cool-down whine of the motor. Naomi stood very still. In stillness, buildings told the truth. She could hear water somewhere beyond the shaft wall, not pouring, not rushing, but moving where it should not be, a creeping, ugly sound like fabric being dragged slowly across tile. Daniel grabbed the radio. Control, this is Reed in the East Freight lift. We are stuck between 17 and 18. Repeat, stuck between 17 and 18 with guests inside. Static answered first. Then a voice, distorted but urgent. Do not restart. I repeat, do not restart. We have got a surge risk on the upper relay. Hold position until engineering clears the line. Eleanor stared at Daniel. Hold position, she said, and all the old authority came back for one sharp second. My granddaughter needs her inhaler. Naomi was already moving. She knelt in front of Sophie, unfastened the top strap of the thermal blanket, and draped it looser around her shoulders so the child's chest had room. You are all right, she murmured. This is just a pause, not the end of the road. Sophie nodded, but Naomi could see the effort it took. Then another sound reached her, faint but unmistakable. A popping crack from somewhere up the shaft, followed by the smell of hot metal. Daniel heard it too. His face changed. Not panic. Worse. The look of a man who finally understood how little time the building might be willing to give them. Naomi lifted her eyes to the narrow seam between the lift doors and the wall, then to the roof hatch above. When she spoke, her voice stayed calm, but every word had weight. Daniel, if that relay fails, this car is not the safest place for a child who cannot breathe. Tell me right now if there is another way out. Daniel looked up at the roof hatch as if willing it to become simpler than it was. The orange bulb overhead gave one more weak pulse, painting his face in a tired, coppery wash before dimming again. There is a maintenance ladder in the shaft wall, he said at last, voice low and careful now, stripped of manager polish. It runs beside the guide rail for emergency access between service levels. But the hatch is manual, and the landing above us is narrow. We would have to go one at a time. Eleanor's hand flew to Sophie's shoulder. Absolutely not. Naomi understood the fear. The lift car was small. The air close, the walls too near when panic started pressing at the ribs. But she also understood the smell creeping stronger through the seams now, hot metal and stressed wiring, the scent of machines deciding how much longer they wanted to behave. She looked at Sophie. The child's breathing had thinned again under the strain of the stop, not ragged yet, but tight enough that every second felt expensive. Naomi reached up, slid the flashlight from her apron, and angled the beam toward the hatch. Dust clung to the edges. A red release lever sat recessed beside the latch. Something about the sight of it made the next step feel ordinary, almost already done. Then I go first, Naomi said. Eleanor stared at her. You are not leaving her. I am not leaving anybody, Naomi replied. I am making sure there is somewhere to take her. Daniel hesitated only a moment before nodding. Together they pushed the housekeeping cart against one wall to make space. Naomi set the flashlight between her teeth, planted one foot on the lowest side rail, then reached for the hatch lever. The metal was cold and slightly slick with condensation. She pulled. For 1 second nothing happened. Then the latch gave with a heavy snap, and the square panel above them shifted upward, spilling down a draft of colder air that smelled like concrete, dust, and rain. Naomi pushed the hatch fully open and lifted herself through with practiced economy. No wasted motion, no drama. Her shoulders disappeared first, then her head, then the rest of her, until only the soles of her work shoes showed for a heartbeat before she stepped onto the maintenance ladder outside the car. Daniel held the hatch frame with both hands and looked up. What do you see? Naomi turned the flashlight beam along the shaft wall. Steel rails. Damp concrete. The side ladder bolted into place. 10 feet above, a narrow service landing cut across the shaft at the 18th floor, protected by a half-height access gate. I see our way out, she said. Her voice echoed down softer than expected, as if the shaft respected calm. Naomi climbed carefully, one rung at a time, testing each step before she shifted her weight. The hotel groaned around her, old bones under storm pressure, but the ladder held. At the landing, she unlatched the access gate and stepped onto a strip of concrete barely 3 feet wide. A service door waited there, gray and unmarked except for a faded stencil that read electrical access, authorized staff only. Naomi swiped her key card. Red light. She tried again. Red. Of course. Upper relay failure meant the mag lock was dead or frozen. She exhaled once, then angled the flashlight down the hall beyond the wire glass inset. Dark, but clear. She crouched, found the emergency mechanical release plate beside the frame, and slid her master key into the hidden slot beneath it. The lock gave with a hard metallic click. Naomi pulled the door open and felt the corridor breathe cold, conditioned air against her face. She leaned over the landing rail and looked down through the open hatch at the 3 people inside the stalled lift. Sophie's pale face tilted up toward her, small and trusting in the dim. Naomi let the child see certainty before anything else. I am here, she called down. The way is open. Daniel went first because Naomi told him to. He climbed through the hatch carefully, shoulders tight, dress shirt catching on the metal edge, then found the ladder with the awkward focus of a man whose whole life had happened behind desks and polish check-in counters. Naomi kept the flashlight trained steady on his hands until he reached the landing beside her. Then Eleanor came next, one hand gripping the hatch frame, the other pressed flat against the roof of the lift, as if she could keep the whole machine from changing its mind. She made it up slower, breath shallow, cashmere coat brushing the concrete wall, but she made it. Sophie was last. Naomi went back down to the lip of the landing and crouched low, both hands extended through the open square. Eyes on me, she said softly. Not the ladder, not the walls, just me. The little girl nodded, face pale in the flashlight beam, then lifted one foot to the first rung. Daniel steadied from below until Naomi could catch her wrists, and in one smooth, careful movement, Naomi drew her up onto the landing and into her arms. Sophie folded there without hesitation, small and warm, and still breathing too tight, but breathing. Naomi wrapped the silver blanket around her again and rose at once. Suite number, she asked. 1824. Eleanor said, voice unsteady with relief and something more fragile than that. They moved fast now, down the narrow electrical corridor and into the rear service hall that ran behind the penthouse suites. The carpet here softened their steps, and the air smelled faintly of cedar, expensive soap, and the cold, filtered hush of wealth. It was a strange thing, Naomi thought, how quickly a place returned to luxury once the danger was hidden behind the walls. At room 1824, Eleanor fumbled for the key card in her handbag, but her hands were shaking. Naomi held Sophie with one arm and took the card with the other. The lock flashed green on the second try. Inside, the suite was dim except for floor-level emergency lights glowing amber beneath the furniture. A white overnight bag with tiny gold stars sat on an upholstered bench near the bedroom door exactly where Sophie had said it would be. Naomi crossed the room, knelt, unzipped the front pocket, and found the inhaler inside beside a child's paperback book and a packet of animal crackers. She returned to Sophie immediately, fitted the inhaler into the child's trembling hand, and guided her through it one slow breath at a time. The first try was shaky. The second was better. By the third, the awful tightness in Sophie's chest began to loosen just enough for Naomi to hear the difference. Air came back in fuller, softer lines. Eleanor sat down hard on the edge of a cream sofa and covered her mouth with both hands. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Rain hissed against the sealed glass beyond the curtains. The sweet smelled of wool, perfume, and the faint medicinal sweetness of rescue. Then, as Sophie shifted in Naomi's arms, something small and bright slid from the folds of the thermal blanket and landed on the rug with a delicate metallic sound. Daniel bent first. When he lifted it, the weak amber light caught a chain of diamonds. The missing bracelet. No one moved. Sophie looked at it, then at her grandmother, eyes suddenly wide with the terrible honesty of children. "I put it in your raincoat pocket before dinner," she whispered. "I was pretending it was treasure. Then the thunder happened, and I forgot." Daniel closed his fingers gently around the bracelet and looked away. Eleanor stared at it, as if it weighed 100 pounds, instead of a few ounces of gold and stone. When she finally lifted her eyes to Naomi, the shame in them was clean and unmistakable. "I accused you in my heart before anyone even said your name," she said, voice breaking on the truth of it. Naomi adjusted the blanket around Sophie's shoulders, smoothed a curl from the child's forehead, and answered in the same quiet tone she had used all night. "The storm only locked the doors, ma'am. The rest was already in the room." By dawn, the storm had exhausted itself. The first light came in thin and silver through the edges of the blackout curtains, turning the suite from amber emergency dimness into the pale, honest gray of morning after fear. Sophie was asleep at last, not collapsed from panic, not curled tight against it, just sleeping, one hand resting over the silver thermal blanket Naomi had tucked around her before sunrise. The inhaler sat on the side table beside a glass of water and a small paperback with a bent corner. Eleanor had not slept. She sat in the armchair nearest the window with her shoes off, her raincoat folded across her lap, the bracelet lying on top of it like a quiet witness. Daniel had gone back downstairs hours earlier to help with the reopening plan, his voice on the revived radio calmer now, steadier, though every so often Naomi still heard it crackle through the hall outside. The building had survived. Wet, rattled, humbled, but standing. Naomi stood near the bedroom doorway, smoothing a crease from her housekeeping apron with the absent motion of someone ready to return to work the second the world allowed it. That was what she always did. When a hard moment ended, she picked up the nearest ordinary thing and continued. Eleanor watched her for a long time before speaking. "You saved her life." Naomi glanced at Sophie, then back at the older woman. "I helped her get through the night," she said. "There is a difference." Eleanor gave a faint, broken laugh that held no pride in it. "Perhaps, but I do know this. I was afraid of the wrong person." Naomi did not answer right away. Outside the sealed glass, the ocean was still rough, dark blue under a washed-out sky, but the wind had lost its rage. Somewhere far below, carts were moving again. Wheels on. Tile. Doors opening. The soft beginning of staff restoring comfort for people who would later describe the storm as an inconvenience over lunch. Naomi knew how quickly nights like this could be turned into anecdotes by people who had not listened closely enough. Eleanor rose slowly from the chair and crossed the room. In the clean gray light, her face looked older than it had the night before, not weaker, just stripped of the distance she had worn so well. She held out Naomi's name tag. One corner of the backing had cracked sometime during the climb through the lift hatch, and Naomi had not even noticed it was missing from her apron. Eleanor fastened it back into place with careful fingers, as though the gesture mattered because it did. "I taught my granddaughter who to fear," she said quietly. "You taught her who to trust." Naomi felt the weight of the small plastic badge settle against her uniform. Naomi Brooks. Housekeeping. Plain black letters on white. Nothing grand about it. Nothing that would impress the people who spent money to avoid seeing the person wearing it. Still, for a second, it felt heavier than gold. Sophie stirred on the bed and blinked awake. Hair mussed, cheeks warm with sleep instead of straying. Her eyes found Naomi immediately. "Are you leaving?" she asked, voice rough and small. Naomi smiled then, the kind of smile that showed more in the eyes than the mouth. I have rooms to turn over, she said softly. This hotel does not clean itself. Sophie pushed herself upright and held out her arms. Naomi crossed the room and let the child hug her once, quick and certain. When she stepped back, the first clean band of sunlight broke through a gap in the clouds and laid itself across the carpet, across the bed, across Naomi's blue uniform and the cart waiting in the hallway beyond. She adjusted the strap on her apron, opened the suite door, and walked back toward the work the morning